I'm Gary, and welcome to another Friday Wrap at the Power of Prudence, where we discuss relevant topics concerning your personal security and safety. This week, we're going to talk about the physiology and psychology of fear. We're going to do that because this past week, there's been a lot of discussion, particularly on the media, about how and why a person could freeze during or immediately following a threat or a violent trauma. And a lot of people don't understand like why a person could just freeze and do nothing. So there are definitely some physiological and psychological things that can lead to that. So we're going to go into those some today. We've all heard of the fight or flight syndrome, right? As far as it goes in response to an emergency, or what we often refer to as an acute stress situation. But the truth is, it's not just fight or flight. It's fight, flight, or freeze. Statistics show that in any acute stress situation, about 15% of the people will take immediate action automatically and do something that can save either themselves or someone else. The majority of the people react by fleeing. They either run instinctively away from where they think the danger is, or they will blindly follow where everybody else is going. Still, another 10 to 15% will freeze. When there are multiple factors that contribute to that, but one of those is studies have shown that if a person in an acute stress situation, if your heart rate gets above 175, there is a greater chance that that person will freeze and be unable to do anything. We have incidents like if you go back to the bombing of the planes hitting the World Trade Center, there were many people that died because they remained frozen in their seats and refused to move. We had another incident called the Navy Yard shootings in the DC area, where a gunman entered an office building and methodically began going down a hallway and entering cubicles and killing people. There were people in cubicles far enough away to have moved or done something, but they ended up curling up in balls in their cubicle and essentially laying there and waiting for him to eventually get to their cubicle where he executed a couple people. So freezing can happen. Let's talk about when we talk about the two autonomic systems that govern our responses to life-threatening emergencies and the difference in those, and then we'll go into some real-life experiences that sort of highlight how this works. So we perceive, when we get a stimulus, we perceive something that might be a threat to us. So our innate God-given senses, in order for self-preservation, gave us two neural pathways that stimulus goes to our brain, gets processed, and then our brain sends an action to our body that results in our efforts to save ourselves. So the first of those is purely autonomic. That's the response that, like, if you get a sudden loud banging noise or something that shocks you, you can't help but your eyes widen, maybe you flinch. there are other things such as your heart rate changes, blood shuts off to the extremities. A lot of things happen automatically. And that is the body's way of preparing you for an emergency, shutting off blood except to the things, your heart and lungs, the main things that you need to keep going to stay alive. And it clears it opens the pathways for those immediate responses. And that's what nature gave us to try to give us the best chance of surviving. This goes back to prehistoric times when, we essentially lived in the wild, and it still holds true today. That can take, that pathway is super fast. It's like, a 15th of a second for a message to pass through that way. Then there is a second pathway that's, you get the same stimulus coming through, but in the brain, it doesn't stay just in the hippocampus where the shorter pathway is governed, but it goes through the other part of your brain where memory and reason and logic are. And it's slower, so this can take 1, even 2 seconds, but that allows you to factor in things such as memory, reason to figure out. Let's give an example. If I'm sitting at a table late at night and suddenly, bang, the door slams open loudly, I can't help but that, my eyes are going to go wild. I'm going to flinch and I, duck down and wonder what happened. So that's that autonomic first response. Well, then this second slower response is where it goes through the memory, and I can factor in things like, oh, it's a real stormy night, the wind's blowing, maybe the wind blew the door open. Or, wait a second, my roommate was out tonight and maybe coming back late at night, and sometimes if they've been drinking too much, maybe they slam the door open. But it allows those things to govern or moderate those first initial responses. And that's also to help for 2 reasons. One is to keep you from overreacting to every single stimulus. It allows that slower pathway that involves the memory, allows you to factor in things to keep you from making an instinctive but incorrect move. Maybe running the way everybody else is running, when memory will serve you that there is another exit that wouldn't be as crowded and might in fact be safer. So that's why we have those 2 pathways. And we can train people. I mean, the first fastest pathway, yes, some of that is automatic, but you can also train that when you rehearse something repeatedly so that you don't have to think. When you get a stimulus, you will automatically respond. Sports people, boxers, soldiers, people train those automatic responses into them so that in a life-threatening emergency, or in the case of a sport, a split second, they can take, they can make a reaction that will bring them out on top. The second pathway is useful because even, like checklists, when we all get on an airplane or get on a ocean-going vessel, we are generally required to sit through a safety brief. Now, you might think, this is stupid. Who's going to know this in an emergency? But studies have shown that when you go through that, it does go into your short-term memory. And then that if you were to become involved in an acute stress situation, that short-term memory can factor in and to help you find a way out or to save yourself. And we'll talk about one of those cases later. But again, that second slower pathway does enable you to have something that's in your short-term memory. So for me, that means that if I'm at a new, unusual place or in unusual or threatening circumstances, I will go through my own checklist and look at things that might come into play to save me in an emergency, just like I was on an airplane. And those will stay in my short-term memory, and I'll be able to use them if needed. So let's go over some examples of how this works. First example I'm going to give is when I was about 13 years old. I was at my parents' home. We had family relatives that had been visiting that got up and departed our house at like 5:30 to drive back to their state. I was sleeping in the basement, so I went back to the basement, lying in bed, and then I started hearing a strange noise. That strange noise was, I think I heard some kind of creaking, and then there was like a little tinkling noise. I instinctively knew that something was wrong, that this was bad, that this was something that was out of place and intentional. But I was afraid. I felt it was life-threatening, and I had nothing in my automatic responses to draw on. I couldn't figure out what that could be, and I became paralyzed with fear. I also was afraid, like I wanted to scream out, but I was separated from the rest of my family by 2 floors. I was afraid that I would be ridiculed for being scared of something that turned out to be nothing. So instead, I curled up in a ball and I tried to pretend that it would go away, but it didn't. And I think as the seconds that seemed like hours ticked by, I probably got more and more frightened. It ended, thankfully, because evidently my mother, who'd been upstairs above the main floor, heard those same noises and came down the stairs to see that people had broken into our garage and had forced the primary lock on the door coming into the house from the garage. And she saw 3 arms sticking through the door, one with a screwdriver prying the molding off, one with a flashlight, and one had a screwdriver and was flicking at the security chain on the door, trying to get that to unlatch. That tinkling noise I heard was that little security chain. She screamed. The people, so 3 arms, so at least 2 people withdrew. They ran, and turned out, it was an attempted burglary. There'd been several in the neighborhood that night. Maybe they saw the car leaving and thought we were gone out of town, would be and make a target of opportunity. But the point of this story is that I froze. I had nothing to draw on. So I didn't know how to act. I couldn't reason a way to work through it. So I curled up in a ball. I don't know, had they entered the house and come in the basement and decided to do something bad, I don't know that I would have moved to save myself. I have no idea, but I froze. So let's go from that instance to 10 or 11 years later. Now I'm in my early 20s. I've graduated college, been a Marine, been through Marine infantry training, some other specialized training. So my reaction to life-threatening situations was way different than it was when I was younger. So now, I visited my parents on leave. They lived in a different house in the same city up north. And, it's Christmas break, so there was snow and ice outside. And I was sleeping in their guest room. I'd heard noise. It was getting about dawn, and I thought maybe a little bit of noise, but nothing that seemed really out of place. And so I'm lying there, kind of half asleep, when suddenly I heard what was the most piercing and horrible scream I've ever heard in my life. To this day, that remains very vivid in my memory. And I'd never, whatever horror movie I'd seen before that, nothing compared to the real thing. And, that turned out it was my mom. Well, I didn't know what happened. I guess what it turns out that happened was I leapt out of the bed and ran out the door, which was right beside a stairway on a split level house, like 7-8 steps going down. And as I looked down that stairway, I saw my mom backing up, holding her hand defensively in front of her, and then looked where she was looking, and across the room, some man was in the house. It's winter. He had a big jacket on, and a lot of hair, but he was in the room. So I can't tell you what I thought, because I didn't think. I was instantly flooded with extreme burning, searing anger. I was afraid, fear. It was just this big combination of, all kind of things hit me, and I just reacted automatically. I guess I jumped the steps, never even used the steps, jumped the flight of stairs, got after this person, and evidently I yelled, growled, guttural, some very horrible things that you would hope, most of us would hope that our parent never heard us say, trying to get to this guy. But, I had a room full of furniture. He had a head start. He ran out the sliding glass door. By the time I got out the door, he was down the driveway and turning down a sidewalk. Hey, still feeling like Superman, coursing with adrenaline and energy. I ran to cut him off. I saw that if I jumped this hedgerow and cut across a neighbor's yard, I could intercept him on the sidewalk. So I went to jump that hedgerow. But hey, it turns out I didn't have any clothes on, and it was snow and ice outside. So when I planned to go over that hedgerow, instead I wound up face down in the snow and ice. And it wasn't until that very moment, as I, shook myself off, and then heard my father, who had woken up, and my brother yelling and coming outside, those were the first moments where I actually had control of my thoughts and actions. And then I realized that, hey, I don't know what's happened inside the house. I don't know how my mom is. I had a sister that was down in the basement. So, the guy was gone. So I said, told my dad and brother, let's get back inside and check on mom and see what's happened. So we did. And Fortunately, my mom had heard this guy, evidently our little dog had gotten up and the guy was trying to shut the dog up, and she heard him, and and then the scream. But what's the point of this? So this is going to that trained response. As a Marine, I was trained to do immediate action in the event that you get caught in a close ambush. In a close ambush, hey, if it's done right, nobody should survive. If you've somehow survived that first half second of fire, your only chance to survive is turn into that, yell and charge at them. And that's your only chance to survive. And that's how I had been trained. So without thinking, when my mind was blank, I fell back on that training. So we can train ourselves and others to take immediate action. It doesn't have to be charging somebody, but we can train ourselves to take immediate action in the event of a life-threatening situation. Later on, I guess as a follow-on to that, the person got away, but 2 or 3 years later, my mom was looking at a newspaper where they lived in Ohio and froze, and there was a picture there, a mug shot, and she said that was the same guy, and he had just been arrested for the rape and murder of a 12-year-old girl. And so was it the same guy? Hey, we'll never know, but it just goes to show you that there's two very different reactions I had. One, freezing and being subject to whatever the other people decided to do. The other was taking matters into our hands. I always prefer to take some sort of action because we have more agency in our destiny. If you freeze or you do nothing, somebody else decides if you live or die. If you do something, maybe in the end it won't work, but you have a lot more agency. So always prefer to have some kind of reaction built in. What about that other case where memory or checklist can come into play that uses that little bit slower neural pathway? Let's go forward now another bunch of years. And I was going through advanced free fall training at the end of some training in Delta Force. So I made it through the preliminary training and simulated jumps over a simulator where it's like a big fan that you can float on top of to learn how to fly. And then my first 2 jumps at the place we were out of a helicopter, I had an instructor holding onto my leg strap. Everything perfect. They said, you're good to go for your first solo jump. They had instructors that would follow me, but not be touching me. I started, everything started well. I exited the aircraft. You're falling as I started gathering speed, I started noticing I would, I'll step back so you can see a bit more, that I was kind of doing this. And so I was calm. I'd learned on the simulator what to do, so I would press or do different things to counteract how that air was flowing over me, to counteract that movement. Well, the thing was, let's say I'm going back like this and I react, Well, then suddenly, I guess I overcompensated, and then it would flop me the other way. So, well, they call this potato chipping. And so I was potato chipping, and I started doing this in the air. And, that's unsettling. I'm on my first jump, and I'm threatening to flip over and get out of control. My right before I jumped, we talk about checklists. My instructor gave me two pieces of advice. He said, one, if you get out of control, go into what they call a modified delta position. So you're kind of do your arms like this and point your legs. So you're kind of flying like this, quite fast, but you're not. It takes you out of any unstable instability, right? So I tried that a couple times, and it worked. But you're going really fast, and you can't pull your parachute in that position. So then I would try to get back stable again, and I would start potato chipping and get worse and worse. And I flipped over a few times, and I tried different things. And I started eventually. I started spinning, and I got at one point where I was doing a flat spin like this, and my vision started going, because I was spinning so much. But then and I ran out of things to do. I tried my reactions, that hadn't worked. I tried this, that hadn't worked, and I was out of options. But then that's where that slower, short-term memory part came in. And I'm falling towards earth, that's it's a little bit daunting there the first few times. And I had every reason to panic, but that went through my head. And the second thing he had told me right before I jumped was, if all else fails, if you go through 4,000 feet, do whatever it takes to get something over your head. So I could barely, I was in a flat spin. I looked down and barely could turn my head enough and look at the altimeter on my wrist and see that I just went through 4,000 feet. So I said, well, hey, whatever it takes. And then I did, all the wrong things. I closed my legs, grabbed both hands in like this, grabbed the ripcord with two hands, and just pulled it like that. Definitely not the way you're supposed to pull a ripcord on a parachute. The parachute deployed. It had some, let's just say, a few twists and some issues, but in the end, I landed on the ground okay. Went up. My instructor ran to meet me. He'd already got on the ground, and he was really amped up. And as time went on, he described for me everything that happened in the air to me and what he'd done to try to save me. And when I closed my legs and reached in, he said, you went into what's called a death spiral. So I guess I was falling like this, head down, and twisting like that. And when I pulled the parachute, he said it's called a death spiral because it goes up and a line gets wrapped around your body and legs, and you can't deploy the parachute. And then you've wrapped up so the reserve can't come out. So anyway, he said that the bag that has the parachute in it actually hit my heels as it went out and bounced in good clean air, and eventually deployed, and I came out okay. But the reason I tell you that story isn't for what happened. It's that I ran out of options. I had no reactions left. I was out of things to do. Then that short-term memory of the checklist of the last things he said played through my mind. And I was able then to take an action that saved me. in our lives now, that's why when I go to a public space, or I go to an outdoor venue, or I go anywhere with my family or myself, I go through a mental checklist. Where are emergency exits? Where are things that provide protection from bullets or shrapnel? Where are other ways I could turn if I'm in a car? Those are all checklists that I go through, because in event of a mass murder, mass shooting, whatever other might happen, I have that in my short-term memory, and my family has it in their short-term memory, that gives us that added edge to survive a life-threatening situation. And I bring this up again this week. Been a lot of talk about how some people, when an act of violence has just happened, could freeze. I hope that we've covered that in great detail. We never know who will freeze and who will not. So it's best to prepare yourself and your family by giving them options, building in automatic responses, and going through checklists. These are just some of the things that can save you and your family in that life-threatening situation. I hope you found this discussion useful, especially given the recent conversation regarding freezing. And I hope that you can put it to practice in your family. If you've enjoyed this and would like to see more, please subscribe and like us and follow us on all the social media platforms. Thank you.